You're inside Oak Creek Crossing. Either join the HOA today or start packing.
Funny, because according to my deed, none of this belongs to your HOA. Ma'am, maybe we should verify the property records first.
They showed up at my door with badges and utility belts, demanding I surrender my property rights to a neighborhood I didn't even live in. The HOA thought they had me cornered. What they didn't know, their pristine $1 million clubhouse was sitting smack in the middle of my legal property. I never asked for a war. But when you inherit 12 acres of prime, untouched woodland in the middle of a rapidly expanding suburban hellscape, a war is exactly what you get. The property belonged to my grandfather, Arthur Mitchell. He bought the land back in the late 1970s when the area was nothing but dirt roads and cattle ranches. Over the decades, the city crept closer, and the developers started circling like vultures. They bought up the surrounding farms, bulldozed the ancient oaks, and paved over the creeks to build Oak Creek Crossing, an ultra-exclusive, gated community with strict architectural guidelines, manicured lawns, and an homeowners association board that operated with the ruthless efficiency of a minor dictatorship. Grandpa Arthur was a stubborn man. When the developers offered him a small fortune for his 12 acres to complete their mega neighborhood, he told them exactly where they could shove their money. Consequently, Oak Creek Crossing was built entirely around his property. My grandfather's land became a donut hole in the middle of a sprawling beige stucco pastry. The only way to access the property was via a legally binding, grandfathered easement road that cut straight through the HOA's pristine entrance. When my grandfather passed away, the land and the sturdy mid-century ranch house, sitting in the center of it, went to me, Jack Mitchell. I was looking for a quiet place to settle down after years of living in cramped city apartments, so I packed up my life and moved in. I knew the surrounding neighborhood was pretentious, but I figured if I minded my own business, they would mind theirs. I was painfully naive. The trouble started on moving day. I was unloading boxes from the back of my rented moving truck, sweating through my shirt in the afternoon heat, when a white golf cart silently rolled up my 200-foot gravel driveway. Out stepped a woman who looked like she had been grown in a lab specifically to complain to retail managers. She wore a crisp pastel pantsuit, a rigid blonde bob that defied gravity, and a smile that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice dripping with condescension. She tapped a heavy acrylic clipboard with a manicured fingernail. "You must be the new tenant." "Owner," I corrected, wiping the sweat from my forehead. "Jack Mitchell. Arthur was my grandfather." Her smile tightened. "I see. Well, condolences. I am Brenda Carmichael, president of the Oak Creek Crossing Homeowners Association. I'm here to welcome you to the community and drop off your orientation packet." She thrust a thick, spiral-bound binder toward me. Tucked under the plastic cover was an invoice. I glanced at the paper. It was a bill for a $5,000 new resident initiation fee and a statement for $350 in monthly dues. I chuckled, handing the binder back to her. "I appreciate the welcome, Brenda, but I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm not part of your HOA. This property is completely independent of Oak Creek Crossing." Brenda did not take the binder. She crossed her arms, the multitude of silver bracelets on her wrist clinking aggressively. "Mr. Mitchell, your driveway connects to our private roads. You are inside our gates. The previous owner was a stubborn old fool who exploited a loophole, but we have updated our community bylaws. Any property utilizing Oak Creek infrastructure for access is subject to our covenants, conditions, and restrictions." "That's not how property law works," I said, my patience already wearing thin. "My grandfather had a deeded easement, which transferred to me. I don't use your amenities, I don't pay your dues, and I am not bound by your rules. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a couch to carry." Brenda's eyes narrowed into slits. "We take community standards very seriously here, Jack. Your gravel driveway is an eyesore. That rusted mailbox at the end of the lane is a violation of Section 4, Paragraph B. and commercial vehicles like that moving truck are strictly prohibited from being parked outside a garage. You have 48 hours to rectify these violations before the daily fines begin. She turned on her heel, marched back to her golf cart, and sped off, kicking up a cloud of dust on my eyesore of a driveway. I thought it was an empty threat, the pathetic power trip of a bored suburbanite. But Brenda Carmichael wasn't just bored, she was obsessed. Within a week, my mailbox was stuffed with official-looking letters on heavy, watermarked paper. I was fined $100 for the moving truck, $50 for weeds near the property line, and $200 because the exterior paint of my house, which was barely visible through the thick tree line, was not an approved earth tone. I gathered all the letters, wrote "Return to Sender," not in HOA in thick black Sharpie across the envelopes, and dropped them back in the mail. I thought that would send a clear message. Instead, it was the equivalent of declaring open war. The harassment escalated from petty letters to active sabotage. My garbage cans, which I brought down to the end of the easement road on collection days, mysteriously disappeared, only to be found dumped in a drainage ditch a mile away. When I ordered materials for a deck renovation, the delivery drivers were blocked at the main gate by the HOA security guard, who claimed my address didn't exist in their approved vendor system. I had to physically drive down to the gatehouse, block the entrance with my truck, and threaten to call the county sheriff for interfering with the mail and interstate commerce before the terrified teenage guard lifted the barrier. One evening, my nearest neighbor, a sweet older woman named Susan Wright, walked her golden retriever up my driveway. She looked around nervously, as if expecting snipers in the trees. "Jack, honey, you need to be careful," Susan whispered, leaning in close. "Brenda's furious. She's been holding emergency board meetings about you. She sees your property as a blight on the neighborhood's property values. She's telling everyone that if she can force you into bankruptcy with fines, the HOA can place a lien on your house and foreclose on it. They want to tear down your grandfather's house and turn your woods into a community tennis center." I thanked Susan for the warning, feeling a cold, hard knot of anger tighten in my chest. They wanted my grandfather's land. They wanted to pave over the last piece of history in this area just so they could hit a fuzzy green ball around. Brenda Carmichael was about to learn a very hard lesson about poking a sleeping bear. I wasn't just going to ignore her anymore. I was going to fight back. The Cold War turned hot on a Tuesday night in late October. The autumn air was crisp, and I was in my living room nursing a cold beer after spending the day repairing a section of my roof. The fines from Brenda's regime had officially crossed the $15,000 mark. I hadn't paid a single dime, and my lawyer had already drafted a cease and desist letter, but Brenda's arrogance blinded her to legal realities. Around 9:30 p.m., the motion sensor floodlights illuminating my driveway violently clicked on. I peered through the blinds and saw a dark, unmarked SUV idling near my front porch. Two men stepped out. At first glance, my heart skipped a beat. They wore dark tactical pants, black polo shirts with gold badges printed on the chest, and thick utility belts loaded with gear. They looked exactly like county sheriff's deputies. A loud, authoritative pounding rattled my front door. "Open up, law enforcement," a deep voice barked. Après. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open, keeping the storm door between us. The two men stood on my porch, trying to look as intimidating as possible. But as I looked closer, the illusion began to crack. The badges on their chests weren't metal. They were high-quality embroidered patches that read Oak Creek Enforcement. Their utility belts lacked firearms. Instead, they carried heavy-duty flashlights, pepper spray, and tasers. "Jack Mitchell?" the taller one asked, shining his flashlight directly into my eyes. I blocked the glare with my hand. "Get that light out of my face. Who are you?" "We are community enforcement officers acting on behalf of the Oak Creek Crossing Board of Directors," the shorter, stockier man said, puffing out his chest. "We have a warrant for your signature." I couldn't help it. I laughed out loud. A warrant for my signature? What kind of fake rent-a-cop television show do you think you're starring in? The taller man's face flushed red. He slammed a hand against the storm door. This isn't a joke, sir. You are in violation of dozens of community ordinances. You are currently utilizing HOA-owned roads to access this property. We have a compliance annexation form. You will sign it right now, acknowledging the HOA's jurisdiction over this lot, or we will physically detain you for criminal trespass and wait for the real sheriff to arrive. Brenda had lost her mind. She had actually hired private security, dressed them up to look like cops, and sent them to my house in the dead of night to intimidate me into signing away my property rights. It was a classic strong-arm tactic that probably worked on terrified, rule-abiding suburbanites. But it wasn't going to work on me. Let me get this straight, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous calm. You drove onto my private property, impersonating law enforcement, to extort a signature from me under the threat of false imprisonment. We aren't impersonating anyone, the tall one stammered, slightly taken aback by my lack of fear. We are authorized agents of the board. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket. Great. Let's get the county sheriff out here. I'm sure they'd love to meet their new, authorized colleagues. I dialed 911 and put it on speaker. 911. What is your emergency? The dispatcher answered. Yes, my name is Jack Mitchell. I'm at 400 Old Mill Road. I have 2 men on my porch wearing tactical gear and fake badges, threatening to kidnap me if I don't sign a real estate document. I need deputies out here immediately. The color drained from the rent-a-cop's faces faster than water down a drain. Hey man, hang up the phone, the stocky one hissed, suddenly looking very much like a guy who realized he was not getting paid enough for this. Are the men armed, sir? The dispatcher asked, her tone shifting to high alert. They have tasers and pepper spray, and they just threatened me with detainment, I replied, never taking my eyes off the 2 men. That was all it took. The 2 enforcers spun around, practically tripping over each other as they sprinted off my porch, threw themselves into their unmarked SUV, and tore down my driveway, spitting gravel in their wake. When the actual county sheriffs arrived 20 minutes later, they were entirely unamused by Brenda's tactics. I gave them the security camera footage of the encounter. The lead deputy, a grizzled veteran named Miller, shook his head in disgust. Impersonating an officer, terroristic threats, attempted extortion. This HOA board is playing with fire, Mr. Mitchell. We'll be paying Mrs. Carmichael a visit tonight. I should have felt victorious, but the incident left me unsettled. Brenda was escalating, and she clearly believed she owned everything the light touched in this zip code. I needed a permanent solution. I needed to know exactly, down to the millimeter, where my property lines ended and where her delusion began. The next morning, I called Richard Hayes. Richard was an old-school land surveyor, the kind of guy who had been mapping out the county since the 1980s. He knew every legal quirk, every buried property marker, and every old deed in the state. I paid him double his usual rate to prioritize my property and conduct an exhaustive, pinpoint-accurate survey of my grandfather's 12 acres. Richard and his small crew spent 3 days tramping through my woods, setting up total stations, digging up rusty iron pins buried decades ago, and cross-referencing satellite data with the original handwritten plat maps from 1972. On the afternoon of the 4th day, I was sitting on my porch when Richard's muddy pickup rolled up the drive. He stepped out, carrying a massive, tightly rolled blueprint tube. He didn't look tired. He looked absolutely giddy. "Jack," Richard said, walking up the steps and tapping the plastic tube against his palm. "I've been surveying land in this county for 42 years. I have seen boundary disputes, overlapping deeds, and neighbors fighting over inches of dirt. I take it you found something interesting?" I asked. offering him a bottle of water. Richard refused the water, unrolled the massive blueprint on my patio table, and weighted down the corners. He traced a thick red line that outlined my 12 acres. Then he pointed to a specific section on the western edge of my property, right where the dense trees met the manicured lawns of the HOA. "Your grandfather, Arthur, was a brilliant man," Richard said, a wide grin spreading across his face. "When the developers built Oak Creek Crossing, they assumed the property line ran straight from the old creek bed to the county road. But it doesn't. Your grandfather's deed includes a jagged 2-acre peninsula that juts straight into what they thought was their development." I leaned over the map, my brow furrowing as I looked at the overlay of the neighborhood's infrastructure on top of my legal boundary lines. "Richard, what exactly is sitting on that 2-acre peninsula?" Richard tapped a large, rectangular shape drawn right in the middle of my red-line property. "Jack, my boy," Richard laughed. "The Oak Creek Crossing developers built their $1.2 million clubhouse, their leasing office, and half of their community pool squarely on your land. You don't just own the woods, you own Brenda's office." I stared at the thick red line on Richard's blueprint, my brain struggling to process the sheer magnitude of the catastrophic error staring back at me. I traced my finger over the rectangular shape denoting the Oak Creek Crossing clubhouse. It wasn't just a small overlap. The property line sliced cleanly through their extravagant leasing office, swallowed their state-of-the-art fitness center whole, and bisected their Olympic-sized saltwater pool directly down the middle of the swimming lanes. "Richard," I breathed, barely able to find my voice. "How is this even physically possible? How does a multi-million-dollar development company accidentally build a commercial structure on someone else's deeded land?" Richard let out a raspy, nicotine-stained laugh, rolling the map back up. "Arrogance and cheap shortcuts, Jack. It happens more often than you'd think." I did some digging at the county clerk's office. Back in 2008, the original developer of Oak Creek went bankrupt during the housing market crash. The project sat half-finished for years. A new conglomerate swooped in, bought the distressed assets for pennies on the dollar, and rushed the completion to get houses on the market. He tapped the side of his head knowingly. They didn't want to pay for a fresh, comprehensive boundary survey. They relied on outdated, flawed preliminary plats drawn up by some junior architect who assumed your grandfather's property was a perfect square. It wasn't. They poured a concrete foundation, built their crown jewel of a clubhouse, and never realized they were trespassing on 2 acres of Mitchell family woodland. And because your grandfather liked his privacy and rarely ventured to the far western edge of his property through the thick brush, he never noticed the encroachment. The sheer poetic justice of it washed over me like a wave of pure adrenaline. Brenda Carmichael, the woman who had terrorized me over the paint color of my own home, was currently presiding over an HOA board that operated out of a building sitting illegally on my dirt. Before I made a single move, I needed bulletproof legal backing. The next morning, I was sitting in the mahogany-paneled office of David Reynolds, a ruthless real estate litigator I had hired on recommendation. David was the kind of lawyer who wore tailored suits and treated property law like a blood sport. David spent 2 hours scrutinizing Richard's survey, my grandfather's original deed, and the county tax records. When he finally looked up, his eyes were gleaming with predatory delight. "It's ironclad, Jack," David said, leaning back in his leather chair. "The first thing their lawyers will try to claim is adverse possession squatters' rights. They'll argue that because the clubhouse has been there for over a decade, the land legally transferred to them. But our state law has a massive hurdle for adverse possession. The squatter must pay the property taxes on the contested land for 7 consecutive years." David spun his laptop around to show me a spreadsheet. "I just pulled the county tax assessor's data. Your grandfather and now you have been paying the property taxes on the full 12 acres, including that 2-acre peninsula, every single year since 1978. The HOA has only been paying taxes on the land around it. Adverse possession is completely off the table. Legally speaking, Oak Creek Crossing has built a very expensive, unauthorized addition to your backyard. So, what's our next move? I asked, a grin fighting its way onto my face. Do we send them a letter? No, David said, his voice dropping into a deadly serious register. We let them keep hanging themselves. Right now, Brenda thinks she has the upper hand. Let her play her cards. We need to secure the perimeter. David's advice proved incredibly timely. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived in my mail. It wasn't from Brenda. It was from the HOA's legal counsel, a slimy attorney named Gregory Pierce. The letter was a masterpiece of legal intimidation. It formally notified me that the Oak Creek Crossing HOA had placed a mechanic's lien on my property for $22,450 in unpaid fines, late fees, and administrative penalties. The document stated that because I had stubbornly refused to sign the integration agreement and comply with their architectural standards, the board had voted unanimously to initiate foreclosure proceedings. If I did not pay the full balance within 30 days, they would seize my grandfather's land and auction it off. They thought they had me trapped in a corner. They thought I would crumble, beg for mercy, and sign over my property to save my home. Instead of panicking, I felt a deep, profound sense of calm. I called David and read the letter to him. He chuckled, filing a fraudulent lien to extort property rights. That just multiplied our countersuit damages by a factor of 10. Jack, it's time to mark your territory. I didn't want to just serve them with paperwork. I wanted them to feel it. I wanted Brenda to wake up and realize her empire was built on sand. I hired a private fencing contractor from 3 counties over guys who didn't care about neighborhood politics and just wanted to get paid for a hard day's work. I met them at the western edge of my property at 5 a.m. on a Saturday morning. The sun hadn't even crested the horizon yet. We marched through the woods, carrying heavy steel T-posts, sledgehammers, and massive rolls of high-visibility, industrial orange construction fencing. Using Richard's neon survey stakes as our guide, we began driving the steel posts into the ground. We didn't stop when we reached the edge of the woods. We drove the steel posts right into the perfectly manicured emerald green lawn behind the clubhouse. We dragged the orange netting across their expensive landscaping. When we reached the concrete pool deck, the crew used masonry drills to anchor the posts directly into their custom-imported tiles. We strung a glaring, 4-foot-high orange barrier that sliced the luxurious patio in half, completely blocked access to the clubhouse's back double doors, and ran straight over the shallow end of the swimming pool, dividing it like a bizarre aquatic border wall. Every 50 feet, I attached a heavy aluminum sign that read, "Private property, no trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted." By 8 a.m., the trap was fully set, physically and legally. Now, all I had to do was wait for the Queen to discover her castle had been invaded. The fallout was instantaneous and explosive. I was sitting on a lawn chair just inside the tree line, drinking a thermos of black coffee when the first resident arrived for their morning swim. It was a middle-aged man with a towel draped over his shoulder. He stopped dead in his tracks, staring at the bright orange fencing bisecting the pool deck. He dropped his towel, pulled out his phone, and started making frantic calls. Within 20 minutes, the pristine quiet of Oak Creek Crossing was shattered by the high-pitched whine of an electric golf cart pushed well past its safe operating speed. Brenda Carmichael came skidding onto the clubhouse lawn, nearly rolling the cart in her haste. She was wearing a plush white bathrobe and oversized sunglasses, her blonde hair uncharacteristically disheveled. She leaped from the cart, her face contorted in a mask of absolute fury. She ran up to the bright orange fencing, grabbing it with both hands and shaking it violently. "What is this?" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the stucco walls of the clubhouse. "Who did this? This is vandalism. This is domestic terrorism." I stepped out from the shadows of the tree line, coffee mug in hand, and offered her a polite wave. Morning, Brenda. Just putting up a boundary fence. You were right about one thing. Property lines are very important. Brenda's head snapped toward me, her eyes wide with rage. You absolute lunatic. I knew you were unstable. I'm calling the police right now, and I'm having you arrested for destruction of private property. You've just handed us your house, Jack. The board will take everything you own for this. Call them, I said calmly, taking a sip of my coffee. I'll wait right here. Brenda furiously dialed 911 on her cell phone, screaming at the dispatcher about a deranged squatter destroying $1 million facility. By now, a crowd of a dozen residents in tennis gear and swimwear had gathered, whispering and pointing at the absurd orange wall splitting their luxury amenities. 15 minutes later, a familiar county sheriff's cruiser pulled into the clubhouse parking lot. It was Deputy Miller, the same officer who had responded to the fake cop incident. He stepped out of his vehicle, adjusted his duty belt, and sighed heavily as he surveyed the scene. "Officer, arrest this man immediately," Brenda commanded, pointing a trembling finger at me. "He has vandalized our pool deck and drilled holes into our property." Deputy Miller walked over, looking at the heavy steel posts driven into the concrete. He turned to me, his expression neutral. "Mr. Mitchell, you want to explain what's going on here?" I reached into my jacket and pulled out a thick, plastic-sleeved folder. I handed it to the deputy. "I am simply securing my legal property boundaries." Deputy Miller. "Inside, you'll find a state-certified land survey completed this week, signed and notarized. You'll also find a copy of my deed and a sworn affidavit from the county tax assessor." Miller opened the folder, reviewing the documents. His eyebrows slowly crept up his forehead as he compared the detailed blueprints to the physical reality in front of him. "This is forged garbage," Brenda yelled, trying to snatch the folder from the deputy's hands. "He's making this up to get out of his HOA fines." Miller held the folder out of her reach, his gaze hardening. "Mrs. Carmichael, step back. This surveyor, Richard Hayes, is well known to the county. This is an official, legally binding document." Miller looked from the blueprint to the clubhouse, and then back to Brenda. "Ma'am, according to this survey, Mr. Mitchell hasn't drilled into your property. He's drilled into his own property. In fact, you're currently standing on his land." Brenda's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "That is a lie. We are Oak Creek Crossing. We own this facility." "That sounds like a civil dispute for the courts, ma'am," Miller said, handing the folder back to me. "But as far as law enforcement is concerned, Mr. Mitchell is within his rights to erect a fence on his deeded land. If you touch that fence, or if you or your residents cross it, Mr. Mitchell has the right to have you cited for criminal trespassing. Have a good day, folks." Miller tipped his hat to me and walked back to his cruiser, leaving Brenda standing paralyzed on the lawn. I thought that might have been the end of it, but Brenda's delusion ran too deep. Instead of calling a lawyer to verify my claims, she went into full denial mode. She sent an emergency email blast to the entire neighborhood, claiming I had presented fraudulent documents to a corrupt police officer and announced a mandatory emergency HOA board meeting that evening in the clubhouse to finalize my property's foreclosure. It was exactly what David and I had hoped for. At 7 p.m., the clubhouse ballroom was packed. Over 100 angry residents were crammed into the folding chairs, murmuring anxiously. At the front of the room, Brenda sat at a long table with the 5 other HOA board members, looking smug and triumphant. David and I walked through the double doors just as Brenda was banging her wooden gavel to call the meeting to order. The room fell dead silent as we marched down the center aisle. "You are not welcome here, Mr. Mitchell," Brenda sneered into the microphone. "This is a private meeting for residents of Oak Creek Crossing." "Actually, Brenda," David said, his booming voice easily carrying across the large room without a microphone, "we are exactly where we need to be. My name is David Reynolds. I am Mr. Mitchell's legal counsel." David walked up to the board's table and dropped a massive stack of legal documents right in front of Brenda. "What is this?" she demanded, refusing to touch the paper. That, David announced to the entire room, is a formal notice to vacate. Attached is a lawsuit for a decade of criminal trespassing, unauthorized commercial development on private land, and extortion. The crowd gasped. The other board members looked at each other in sheer panic. I stepped forward, looking directly into Brenda's eyes. "Your developer screwed up, Brenda. They built this clubhouse, your office, and half of that pool on my grandfather's land. The state recognizes my ownership. Your fraudulent lien means nothing." I turned to face the shocked audience of residents. "This building belongs to me. You have 30 days to vacate my property and remove your structure. If you fail to do so, I will assume full ownership of the building, and the Oak Creek Crossing Homeowners Association will be required to pay me $15,000 a month in commercial rent to use my facilities. Furthermore, my lawyer will be seeking back rent for the last 12 years, totaling roughly $2.1 million, which, according to your bylaws, every single homeowner in this room is financially liable for." The silence in the room was so absolute you could have heard a pin drop. Then, absolute chaos erupted. The chaos that erupted in the clubhouse ballroom was nothing short of biblical. Over 100 residents were simultaneously on their feet, screaming at the top of their lungs. Some were yelling at me, demanding to know if this was a sick joke, but the vast majority had turned their furious attention directly toward Brenda Carmichael and her cronies on the board. Brenda was frantically banging her wooden gavel against the table, her face purple with rage and panic. "Order! I demand order! This is a bluff! He is lying!" She shrieked into the microphone, but her voice was completely drowned out by the terrified roar of homeowners, realizing they were suddenly on the hook for a $2 million legal blunder. David and I didn't stay to watch the rest of the bloodbath. We simply turned around, pushed open the double glass doors, and walked out into the cool night air, the muffled sounds of a suburban civil war echoing behind us. The very next morning, David's office phone rang at 8 a.m. sharp. It was Gregory Pierce, the HOA's notoriously aggressive attorney. Only this time, Gregory wasn't threatening foreclosures or throwing around heavy legal jargon. He sounded breathless, frantic, and desperate to settle quietly. He offered to drop the $22,450 in fines and formally acknowledge my grandfather's easement if I would just take down the orange fence and sign a quitclaim deed handing over the 2-acre peninsula. David literally laughed into the receiver. "Gregory, my client now owns a multi-million-dollar commercial structure because your clients were too cheap to hire a surveyor 12 years ago. We aren't taking down the fence, and we aren't signing away anything. See you in court." Despite Gregory's desperate attempts to backpedal, Brenda refused to surrender. Her ego simply could not process the reality of her defeat. She forced the HOA into a grueling, highly public legal battle, draining their reserve funds to fight my lawsuit. 3 months later, we found ourselves standing in the county courthouse before Judge Harrison Caldwell, a no-nonsense adjudicator with zero tolerance for frivolous litigation. The hearing lasted less than 45 minutes. Judge Caldwell spent the first 20 minutes forensically examining Richard Hayes's certified land survey, my grandfather's original deed, and the county tax assessor's records. When he finally looked down from the bench, his glare was severe enough to peel the paint off the walls. "Mr. Pierce," Judge Caldwell said, addressing the HOA's sweating attorney, "I have presided over property disputes in this county for 2 decades. This is, without a doubt, the most egregious example of corporate negligence and subsequent administrative harassment I have ever witnessed. Your clients built a commercial facility on private property, failed to pay taxes on the land, and then attempted to use fraudulent fines to extort the rightful owner out of his inheritance to cover up their mistake." The judge slammed his gavel down. "I am ruling entirely in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Mitchell. The Oak Creek Crossing Homeowners Association is ordered to immediately cease all operations on the contested property. Furthermore, I am awarding Mr. Mitchell the requested $2.1 million in back rent, plus full coverage of his legal fees. If the association cannot produce these funds within 60 days, the physical structure of the clubhouse will be fully forfeited to Mr. Mitchell. Brenda actually fainted in the courtroom. The fallout was spectacular. The HOA's insurance policy contained a specific clause excluding coverage for boundary disputes resulting from initial developer negligence. They had absolutely no safety net. The $2.1 million judgment essentially bankrupted the Oak Creek Crossing HOA overnight. Faced with massive special assessments that would ruin them financially, the residents of Oak Creek finally woke up. They organized an emergency recall election and ousted Brenda and every single member of her board. My sweet neighbor, Susan Wright, was elected as the new emergency president. Susan came to my house the next day, practically in tears, begging for mercy on behalf of the innocent families in the neighborhood who had been caught in Brenda's crossfire. I am a reasonable man, and I had no desire to bankrupt single mothers and retired couples just to make a point. David and I drafted a brutal but fair settlement. I agreed to forgive the $2.1 million in back rent and spare the homeowners. In exchange, the HOA was forced to permanently dissolve all jurisdictional claims over my access road, pay David's exorbitant legal fees out of their remaining reserve funds, and the absolute cherry on top sign the clubhouse deed entirely over to me. They accepted immediately. Today, Oak Creek Crossing is a very different place. The HOA was stripped of its enforcement powers and reduced to a voluntary neighborhood garden club. Brenda Carmichael, facing intense social ostracization and the threat of personal lawsuits from her former neighbors, sold her house at a loss and moved out of state. As for me, I didn't tear down the clubhouse. Instead, I hired contractors to remodel it. The leasing office, where Brenda used to plot her reign of terror, is now my private home theater. The state-of-the-art fitness center is my personal gym. And on hot summer days, I enjoy floating in my Olympic-sized swimming pool, sipping a cold beer, and waving at my neighbors through the permanent, decorative wrought iron fence that now officially marks the border of my grandfather's land. And that is how you legally conquer an HOA and take their prized clubhouse for yourself. If you loved hearing Brenda's corrupt empire crumble to the ground, smash that like button and share this video to spread the justice. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable true-life revenge stories, and let me know in the comments below what is the most insane rule your HOA has ever tried to enforce.